Good morning, Rutherford County. This is Rusty and Lynn Millwood with Word of Faith Fellowship, and we're glad to be with you this morning. This morning, I'd like to share with you some things God's been speaking to me, and God's really been dealing with my heart on. We as a church, we've been in 1 Corinthians 13 sharing about the love of God, and when the preaching came forth originally, maybe back in '95 to our church, God really took me back in my life and dealt with a lot of areas of my life. And we were actually going through some strong persecution back then, and God really showed me a lot of important things, a lot of areas that I didn't know were still in my heart. So when it came around again recently, the last few months, God's been speaking to us and out of 1 Corinthians 13 about His love and how we're to show the love of God to others and not notice when we've had a suffered wrong. God really took me back again and reminded me of some areas of my life that were really important and were really life-changing for me. And it was started back when playing sports. You know, I have three brothers. We all grew up playing sports. And, when we started, you start as a young age, 6, 7, 8 years old. You don't really realize what you're stepping into. And, we started out playing football and baseball and basketball, but mostly football and baseball. And we realized once we got involved in it that, there was a whole standard that was set, that the world sets, or I could say that the devil actually set for me. There's a standard that you cannot really live up to. And that standard tormented me most of my life until I came to this church and learned about forgiveness and about the true love of God. And, when I played sports and I made a mistake, the self-abuse was so bad. And I came to a point where I began to hate myself. And it was such a vicious cycle. You do good one game or one play, you do bad the next play, and you just beat yourself up and you beat yourself up, and you really can never come up out of that. Whether it be coaches that tell you that you're terrible or you're a stupid idiot, or all those things that are said to you from your friends at that time, or why, hey Millwood, why did you do that? That was ridiculous. Well, all that stuff goes on the inside of you, and you begin to carry that over in other areas and other parts of your life. And that's really what had happened to me. I had become so self-abusive and just so distraught in my life that I really began to come to a point where I hated myself, to the point I would even look at myself in the mirror sometimes and say, I hate myself. And when just do little things wrong, you drop something or you forget something, you just, I would say to myself, you stupid idiot, why did you do that? And it just carried over into all my relationships with my parents, with my brothers, and it just became a vicious cycle in my life. And so when I started coming to the church and we started a softball team, my life really began to change when Jane began to come out and help us on the ball field. And I could feel all that abuse in my heart when I would miss a ball, because I hadn't had any deliverance. I had no idea what was still there, because I had not played ball in several years. So you get out on the ball field and all that same old stuff starts coming up. And it really showed me that I really had a lot of self-hatred still in my heart. And so when she began to come out and teach us how to play ball by the Spirit of God, it really began to change my life. And in the beginning, my natural mind is like, well, what does she know about playing ball? Well, she knew a lot, because she knew how to teach us the spiritual principles. We weren't out there for ourselves, because I was full of pride. I was full of haughtiness. I was full of myself. But on the other hand, I hated myself. And that's just the assignment that was at my life, of destruction, for me to be destroyed, And actually, I lost my hair at a young age, at 15 in high school. So that was just a lot more self-abuse that I began to give to, and began to hate myself and despise myself. And so when she began to come out on the field and coach us and teach us. I mean, I really began to start to see a difference, that when she would say, well, Rusty, you could have had that ball. And I'm like, well, it was way over there. And she said, but did you really inquire of God? Did you ask God? Well, no, I didn't even think to ask God. And the reason I didn't think to ask God is because I had all that pride and haughtiness that I thought I knew how to play sports and play ball without even asking God. Well, what do you need to ask God for? And so God really began to speak to me and show me, and he really began to deal with my heart. And in 1 Corinthians 13, it talks about the love of God, as I said before, but it says, love endure, and verse 4, love endures long and is patient and kind. Well, I had no patience and no kindness for myself at all. And it says, love never is envious nor boils over with jealousy. And I was full of jealousy, and is not boastful or vainglorious. And I was very boastful. I was very haughty and very prideful. And I gloated in when I did do good. But now on the other hand, when I did bad, once I got home, it was just all that abuse. It does not display itself haughtily. And I love to display myself haughtily. And it is not conceited. I was full of conceit. It is not arrogant, and it's not inflated with pride. And when I began to read this, I began to see that I was all of this. And I had no love of God in my heart for myself, for God, for myself, or for anybody else. And it says, it is not rude, unmannerly, and it does not act unbecomingly. Love, God's love in us, does not insist on its own rights. And I was very selfish, and I always insisted on what I wanted and its own way, for it is not self-seeking, it is not touchy or fretful, and I was very touchy and fretful, or resentful, and it takes no account of the evil done to it. And this is an important part for me. It takes no account of the evil done to it. It pays no attention to a suffered wrong. So I began to seek God, and I began to cry out to God and ask God, how can I change? And God began to use King David's life and the scriptures to begin to show me. He began to use Paul's life to show me, because I couldn't see a way out. I just never could forgive myself for things that I'd done throughout my whole entire life. Things that were wrong, things that were just so ungodly that I just could not seem to get past, to be able to, where I felt like I could go on and I could serve God with all my heart. And so God began to take me to King David, and God began to speak to me, and he began to show me, if I can forgive King David for what he did. King David, he had a man killed so he could have his wife, and he committed adultery with her. And when he did all that, it was a great sin. And so when the prophet Nathan came to him and spoke to him and gave him the word of the Lord, God began to show me how humble David was. David was a humble man. He was a man after God's own heart. And God began to speak to me and show me that if I can forgive King David, he was a murderer and he committed adultery. And God said, I forgave him. And he said, Rusty, I want to forgive you, but you've got to learn to forgive yourself. And I have forgiveness there for you. You just have to receive it. And so my eyes began to be open. When I went in the scriptures and I began to read in Samuel about King David and his life and what he did. And God did send the prophet and deal with King David very strong. And he told King David, you are the man. You're the man. And King David said, that's right. And he humbled himself and he repented. And I began to cry out to God, and I began to seek God. And I began to see that God does want to forgive me. And for the first time, I felt God's love coming to me. And so then he took me over to read about Paul. Paul was, before he was Paul, he was Saul. And he persecuted the Christians. He hated the Christians. He was there when holding the coats of the men that stoned Stephen to death. And he encouraged them to do it. And, Paul, when he began to read and he began to share, when you begin to read about Paul and see where he began to share when his heart changed after he met Jesus on the road to Damascus, when he began to share his testimony with the other Jews that he ran with, they began to hate him for it. And when I began to see the change in his life, it really began to open my eyes even more, because I could see where Jesus came to him on that road to Damascus and said, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Why are you doing these things? Why are you coming against me? Don't you know it's going to turn out bad for you? But the first thing that he did was he humbled himself. And he said, Lord, what would you have me do for you? And that began to get to my heart. And it began to change my life. And I began to say, Lord, what would you have me do for you? I want to be your servant. But I haven't been able to get past all this self-hatred and all this abuse and all this torment of trying to live up to standards. You know, you just carry it from the world into the church. And unless you have deliverance and get set free, unless you seek God and you cry out to God with all your heart, you're still going to carry that baggage with you. And I began to see Paul's life. Saul, when he became Paul that day, his life began to change forever. And I said, God, that's what I want. I want my life to change. I don't want to be that old man that hates, that despises, that's a bad testimony, that's a bad example. And I want to be an example for you, Jesus. I want to change. I want to know you. I want to seek you with all my heart, and I want to acquire that love. You know, it says in, I think the biggest thing and the biggest cry in my heart still today is in 1 Corinthians 14 verse 1, it says, eagerly pursue and seek to acquire this love. And that was my heart's cry. You know, back in 1995 when we were going through all that persecution, God really began to show me that how I thought I had changed a lot, but I could see where people that I thought were my enemies, I could still feel stuff in my heart toward them, and I could begin to feel that's wrong. I shouldn't feel that way, because God's very clear that we're to love our enemies. We're to show them the love of God. We're not to have any hatred or anything in our heart toward them. And so God began to show me, eagerly pursue and seek to acquire this love. Make it your aim and your great quest. And a quest is a long journey, and it's never ending. So when the love of God came back around again this time to our church, I began to see with what we're going on in our country, with what's going on in our country today, I begin to see that there's still areas in my life that I still don't have the love of God worked in me like I need to, because when I would see things happen to people, I would think, yeah, they deserve that. Or I would see something happen to this group of people over here. Yes, they deserve that. And God stopped me, and he said, Rusty, that's not my love. That's not what I want you to be. My love is, I love everyone. I may hate their sin, but I love people. And God began to deal with me again, and he told me, he said, Rusty, your past righteousness is not going to save you and get you to heaven. Just because you got a work of love done in your heart up to this point, he said, I'm coming again to show you what's still on the inside of you, where you still have that hatred for people. And I said, but God, I don't want that. And you know, I didn't go around thinking I hated anybody, but not to have the love of God in my heart for my brother, and not to want to see them come to know Jesus like I did, because God had a lot of mercy on me, and a whole lot of mercy on me for me to be able to be sitting here today sharing with you, because I don't deserve what I have. I don't deserve my beautiful wife. I don't deserve our daughter that we have. I really don't deserve any of it, but I'm grateful that God had mercy on me, and God told me you should have mercy and love and compassion on all those other people. And so there's several scriptures I know God gave me. Matthew 5:43 through 48. I'd like to read that to you. It says in verse 43, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, Jesus said, I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, to show that you are children of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the wicked and on the good, and he makes the rain fall upon the upright and the wrongdoers. For if you love those who love you, what reward can you have? And that's what God began to show me. What reward can I have? If I love those that love me, that's easy. It's easy to love people back that love you. But what about people that hate you? What about people that persecute you? What about people that would like to see something bad happen to you? Do not even the tax collectors do that? They love those that love them. And if you greet only your brethren, what more than others are you doing? Do not even the Gentiles, the heathen, do that? You therefore must be perfect, growing into complete maturity. And that's my heart's cry. I want to grow into that complete maturity of godliness in my mind and in my character, having reached the proper height of virtue and integrity, as your heavenly Father is perfect. And that's my heart's cry. I want to have that. I want to have that worked in my heart. I want to have that perfect love, that it doesn't matter that what's going on in our country right now, that when somebody has done something wrong, that I'm thinking, good, they deserve that. I don't want that in my heart. And that's where my heart's cry has been. I've been crying out, God, I don't want to have that in my heart. And as, you know, going through all this with God taking me back and reminding me what he brought me from, with all the sports and with all the self-hatred, and where God delivered me, and God set me free from all that. And God began to speak to me again and say, Rusty, I want to do a deeper work in your heart. I want to go further down in the depths of your being, because you've got to have that perfect love, and you can't have anything in your heart toward anyone.
And in doing that, you know, what you've shared with me before is where you had to live up to that standard of pleasing your coaches, pleasing your dad, pleasing your brothers around you. And that is where your standard was set. It was in pleasing people instead of pleasing God. And the love of God, when we love Jesus, all we want to do is be pleasing unto him. And that's where, even going back where he was sharing about King David, you know, his heart was, he wanted an upright heart, a conscience and tender heart, a contrite heart before God, to be pleasing. If you look in Psalms 51, it tells you this is what his heart's cry was after he gave to all that sin. He asked Jesus to create in him a clean heart, a heart that was pure before God. And it starts in verse 10. It says, create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right, persevering and steadfast spirit within me. And only the love of God can do that for us. Only God's love can come to us and show areas of our hearts that aren't right before him. And that is what our heart's cry is. You know, there's areas of our hearts that we don't know are still wrong. But it's that cry like David had, create in me that clean heart, O God. And in verse 11 it says, cast me not away from your presence, and take not your Holy Spirit from me. And that's where we want to be, in God's presence, living in his presence, dwelling in him, dwelling in us, that he can reveal to us areas of our hearts that need to change so that we can be perfected, like Rusty just read. It says, restore to me the joy of your salvation, and uphold me with a willing spirit. And when it comes to what he was talking about, coming to sports, there wasn't a willingness to prefer your brother. It wasn't a willingness to just drop everything and do what your dad wanted you to go do in the house. There wasn't a willingness to stop and do the schoolwork that you so needed to accomplish. It was, in areas even in our lives today, a willingness to stop and see that the person beside us is hurting. And we want Jesus to uphold us. And when we have that, we have the joy of our salvation, because we know that what we're doing is being pleasing to God. And if you go on further, It says, then I will teach transgressors your ways, and sinners shall be converted and return to you. And that's what we want our lives to be, as a testimony that when God's dealt with us and done a work in our hearts, it's to turn around and help somebody else. And then in verse 17, he says, my sacrifice, the sacrifice acceptable to God, is a broken spirit, a broken and a contrite heart, broken down with sorrow for sin, and humbly and thoroughly penitent. Such, O God, you will not despise. And when we miss it, we can turn to Jesus. He's right there to forgive us, to forgive, and we can forgive ourselves when we go to Jesus. And it says he will not despise it. That means it will be pleasing to him. And when that's our aim and our goal is to be pleasing to him, we're going to do exactly what he wants to do. We're going to speak the words that he wants us to speak. We're going to reach out and grab and hold on to somebody that needs a loving hug, or an uplifting. We'll be right there. And so that's where you saw a lot in what God showed you with even your dad.
Yes.
And forgiving your dad for how he expected you to do what he thought you should do.
That's right.
And in that competition you had with your brothers, and forgiving yourself. Yes. Where you didn't have the love of God, and you wanted to do better than your brother. You want to hit it harder than your brother. And God showed you a lot through that.
And a lot of that's changed with the four of us now. I mean, we love each other, and the work of God's so been done in us because we did have a lot of competition and among ourselves. And our dad, he loved us, but he wanted us to do so good that, it affected us, and he didn't realize how it affected us. We're trying to live up to a standard that it's impossible to live up to a standard that you want to be the best, but you can never achieve it because it's not done by the Spirit of God. And you're always going to fall, and you're always going to fail when you don't have Jesus in your heart. And that's the thing that I really begin to see, is that when you don't have Jesus, and we go out on that ball field and you don't have Jesus, when we first started learning to play softball, a different way than what we learned in the world, we didn't have Jesus. It was like, well, I can't believe so-and-so didn't catch that, or I can't believe Ryan. I mean, we turned so many double plays growing up. He played second and I played short, and I'm like, I can't believe you dropped that. But that wasn't the love of God. And now it's so different. Over the years, God has taught us, no, I want to pray for Ryan. What I want to go check on Ryan, and what happened, Ryan. It's okay. It's not. This is just a ball game. It doesn't matter. What matters is that we feel the love in our heart for each other. Because one time I might get up and hit a home run. The next time I might pop up to the infield. But it's different for me now. I don't feel that abuse. I don't feel that rejection. And our team is, I mean, we love each other so much. We just come over and just tell each other it's going to be all right. We're going to take hold and do better the next time. We're going to get a hit the next time. So, I mean, it's changed a lot. I want to read in 1 John chapter 4 also. It talks about the hate if you have anything in your heart towards your brother. First John 4:20 and 21. It says, if anyone says, I love God, and hates and detests and abominates his brother in Christ, he is a liar. For he who does not love his brother, whom he has seen, he cannot love God, whom he has not seen. And this command, charge, and it's a commandment for us to love our brother. And this command, charge, order, injunction we have from him, from God, that he who loves God shall love his brother, believer also. And that's where God's really began to help me and begin to show me and begin to speak to me, to have that true love of God. What does it mean to have that true love of God? When I was referring to Paul earlier, Paul stood when he was sharing his testimony, when he was standing before the rulers at that time, and he was sharing his testimony with them and the Jews. He began to say, I have wronged no man, and I have done nothing wrong. I have wronged no man, and I have done nothing wrong to anybody. And for Paul to be able to stand and say that spoke volumes to me. And it was an open door for me to be able to realize, hey, if Paul, who persecuted the Christians, who fought against God, who made sure people were thrown in prison, who were there when people were flogged, who was there when Stephen was stoned to death, holding the coats and encouraging them to stone Stephen to death, for him to be able to stand there and say, I am innocent, guilty of wronging no man, and doing nothing wrong to anybody, he understood true repentance. He understood humility. And that's what I saw with King David and with Paul, that they had humility. They were humble. And I said, God, that's what I want to be. I want to be a humble man. I want to have that humility. And when correction comes to me from God, I want to be able to receive it. Like when God spoke to me, recently, Rusty, your past righteousness is not going to save you. For you to feel anything in your heart that you liked anything about anybody having something done wrong to them, if you like that, then your heart is wrong. And I really am grateful that God was able to speak to me and show me that, because I don't want to have that in my heart. And I want to have the true, pure love of God in my heart for everyone. And so, all that, with going through the persecution we're going through now, in this country, with all the things that are happening with everybody, it's easy to step over the line and say, well, I don't like what they did. I don't like what they said. But what is God saying about it all? That's what we all should be checking our hearts. What does God say? If we have love, then love covers a multitude of sin, and it conquers all. And that's my heart's cry, and that's my heart's desire, is to have that love in my heart, for everyone.
And that's where God's been speaking to me, is that, the one thing he read in 1 Corinthians 13, it says, love is not self-seeking. And where, when we love Jesus and all we want to do, like I said before, is please him, we'll have the love of God in our heart. We won't be so consumed with ourselves, and we won't be concerned about, what's going on with us. We'll be concerned about the people around us. Yes. And I've been reading in Matthew 25 where Jesus was talking about he's coming back to take those on his right hand, those who are walked upright with him. Let's read it really quick. It says in verse 32, it says, all nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them, the people, from one another as a shepherd separates his sheep from the goats. And he will cause the sheep to stand at his right hand, but the goats at his left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, come, you blessed of my Father, you favored of God and appointed of eternal salvation. Inherit, receive as your own the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. And I was seeing right there, God's prepared a kingdom before the foundation of this world for us that will choose to love God and walk uprightly before him. And they begin to question, how... and he said, he began to tell them, because when I was hungry and I was thirsty, you gave me drink, you fed me, you did all these things for me. And that they didn't even see where they had done that, because their hearts were so in the love of God to reach out to people, not even knowing that they were doing it unto Jesus. That just the love of God compelled them to be a blessing to somebody, to reach out to them. But it says, but those who don't, and they're selfish, they don't see when someone's hungry. They don't see when someone's thirsty. That's right. All they see is what they can accomplish and what they can do. And it says that they'll be cast into eternal judgment. And I know that's all of our heart's cry, is that we want to go to heaven one day with Jesus, and we want to be with him, and we want to do exactly what he's called us to do, so that he can say to us, well done, my good and faithful servant. Enter into my rest. And that is the true love of God waiting for us. Yes.
Well, we're so glad you joined us this morning. We're here on WCAB on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 8:30 to 9. And you can also go back and listen to any of the radio programs on wordoffaith.org. And thank you for joining us again this morning, and have a wonderful day.